computer. Good afternoon, Susan, producer Susan. How are you doing today?
Good, Jersey Joe. How are you?
I'm just fine, thank you. And by the way, you know where Bethel Park PA is?
I do. It's a suburb of Pittsburgh.
Well, good, because our taxpayer relief shot today comes from Bethel Park PA. By the way, I learned something interesting today. Do you know that you don't need a parachute to go skydiving?
Not the first time.
Not the first time. You only need a parachute if you want to do it twice. So,
Yep.
Interesting little bit of trivia there. Anyway, so since we only have 30 minutes, let's talk about what we hope to cover today. And again, it's the situation with Jerzee Joe. It's news and perspective you won't hear on TV. You probably haven't heard of some of these stories, and on the rest, you may have heard one side and you haven't heard the rest. My quote of the day will be from the founder of the Italian Communist Party, a guy named Antonio Gramsci, back from the 1920s, and why socialism must triumph over Christianity. Today's trivia question: how did the coffee chain Starbucks get its name? The Stupid Criminal Award winner of the week comes to us from St. Cloud, Florida. I had a listener question. Somebody wrote into Joe at jerseyjoe.com and wanted me to explain the difference between the budget deficit and the national debt and why rising interest rates are bad for both of them. We'll talk about a proposal that the governor of California is backing on reparations for Black residents of the state of California. And we'll talk about Tesla's new EV tractor trailer that made its debut yesterday. Pepsi has put in an order for a bunch of them, and Pepsi did its first run of their electric vehicle tractor trailer. We'll talk about what it can and can't do and why it won't, why I don't believe it'll ever be viable. And again, our taxpayer relief shot from Bethel Park, PA. You think we can fill 30 minutes with that?
That sounds like 60 minutes.
All right. So anyway, I found this quote from the 1920s absolutely chilling. And again, it's from Antonio Gramsci. He was a politician. He was a journalist. He was an essayist. He did a lot of writing, but he was a Marxist. And he was the founder of the Italian Communist Party, which, by the way, eventually led to the rise of Mussolini and their participation in World War II. But here's his quote that I found chilling. And before I start this, are you familiar with the term the long game?
Yes.
All right. Most Americans think in terms of the short game. Our short game is 2 years. It's the next election cycle. That's our time horizon. The next, we play the short game. Here's the long game. And here's his quote from the 1920s. Quote, "Socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. In the new order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media by transforming the consciousness of society." Do you think they've almost completely achieved that?
Some days I feel like they have.
And if they haven't already completely achieved it, they're getting very, very close. And you talk about, when I went to school way before your time, most of my teachers were either veterans of World War II, or they were the wives of World War II veterans, or the daughters of World War II veterans, or the brothers and sisters of World War II veterans. Very, very conservative values, hardworking, Christian values, and that's gone away. Today, if you say to a teacher, anybody in your family, ever fought in a war, I doubt 5% of them would say, yes, I had a family member, fought in a war. And I think that's what's happened because, clearly the bulk of our college professors, PhDs are clearly, leaning very strongly towards socialism and liberalism. You find very few conservatives in the upper levels of education. Anyway, so that's my. I'm dismayed and concerned about the triumph of that long game. Again, that quote's 100 years old, and it's been flourishing and surviving. Anyway, let's go back to my trivia question. Sue, do you have any idea how the coffee chain Starbucks got its name?
I actually don't know how they got their name.
You know where Starbucks was founded?
I do in Seattle.
Seattle now. So let me tell you, here's a clue. Does the name Herman Melville ring a bell?
Yes. From
What?
the whale, right?
Moby Dick, right.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the founders of Starbucks, I mean, they founded it. One of the guys was a writer, big fan of Herman Melville, and it was Seattle, and they wanted to try to maintain some maritime link. They want to have this maritime connection because it was Seattle. And he said, well, how about, we name it after, Moby Dick? How about we name it after, remember the name of the ship in Moby Dick?
Oh, I don't recall.
The Pequod. Anyway, he said, well, how about we name it after the ship? And they said, oh, Pequod, that's a, no awful name. And they said, well, how about we name it after the first mate in the novel Moby Dick? And the name of the first mate in Starbucks, in Moby Dick, was Starbuck. So that's how Starbucks got its name. It was named after the first mate of the Herman Melville book, Moby Dick. So
Interesting.
you learn something new every day, right?
Yeah.
Okay. You'll actually learn two things. You also learn that you don't need a parachute if you only want to skydive once. So, all right. Let's talk about the Stupid Criminal of the Week award. There was a guy in St. Cloud, Florida, decided he wanted to rob a local Walmart. The only problem, he went into Walmart with his gun to rob the place. Walmart, the day he decided to do that, Walmart was hosting a community event known as Shop with a Cop Day, and there were 40 armed police officers in the store. You probably didn't hear about that one on the local news, did you?
No.
Needless to say, the guy was quickly arrested, handcuffed, and hauled away before he could accomplish anything. But can you imagine deciding to rob a store that has 40 police officers inside? All right. All right. Moving right along. Listener question again, and came into Joe at jerzee-joe.com. He wanted me to explain the difference between the annual budget deficit and the national debt. And I tacked on and why interest rates are bad for both. Well, first of all, I think most of our listeners would probably know the budget deficit is simply a one-year thing. It's the difference between what the government takes in taxes and what it spends. And for the past couple of years, that number has been hovering around 1.5, 1.7 trillion dollars. And by the way, a trillion is 1,000 billion. So when somebody says we had a 1.7 trillion dollar deficit, that means that we had a 1,700 billion dollar deficit. And by the way, we're taking in about 4.5 billion in tax revenues, which, by the way, I think I mentioned in an earlier podcast. Despite the Trump tax plan that cut tax rates, the same thing that happened when Reagan cut tax rates, we have set, for the second consecutive year, we have set new all-time record highs for tax revenues. $4.5 trillion is what the U.S. recorded in tax revenues for the fiscal year that ended September 30th. And that 4.5 trillion is far above the projection. If you continue to grow tax revenues under the old Obama plan at the traditional 2.5% per year rate, you'd only be about 3.9 trillion. So the Trump tax plan has resulted in just incredibly, new record high tax revenues. But at the same time, budget deficits have increased. Well, how do budget deficits increase if you're setting new records for tax revenues? You want to take a guess, Sue?
Nope.
Simple. You're growing spending, federal spending, faster
Yep.
than the
Okay.
rate of revenue increase. So yes, we have a growing budget. Actually, Biden, this last year, I think Biden shrunk it from, 1.5 down to 1.1 trillion. But we're still running a deficit despite having record tax revenues. Now, the national debt is the sum of all prior annual budget deficits. So as an example, if you ran an annual budget deficit of $1 trillion per year for 5 years, at the end of 5 years, you'd have a national debt of 5 trillion. In the case of the US, we're on track to hit a $33 trillion cumulative national debt this year. Now, that is a 2.07% interest rate, which came out to $620 billion per year, which was about 10% of our total federal spending is just paying the interest rate on the national debt. Do you know where we borrow that money from and how that we get to that 2%, 2.07% interest rate?
No, we're borrowing from other countries though too, aren't we?
Well, we borrowed from a lot of sources, including other countries. When the government needs money once a quarter, the president tells the Secretary of the Treasury, "Hey, we need some money." And the Secretary of Treasury holds what's called a Treasury bill auction. It's all electronic. And they auction off, 2-year, 5-year, 10-year Treasury bills. And traditionally, the shorter the term, the lower the interest rate. And they have an auction. They say, all right, who wants to buy some 10-year Treasury notes for 2%? And if nobody electronically raises their hand, they say, all right, how about 2.125%? And if nobody raises their hand, all right, how about 2.25%? And they keep going up and up and up. And maybe get to like 2.5%. And maybe some people raise their hand and say, yeah, I'll buy, I'll buy 30 billion of 10-year Treasury notes at 2.5%. But if they need more, they keep running the auction up and up and up until they get enough money. So if the president says, hey, we need 500 billion of borrowed money this quarter, they keep auctioning off Treasury bills until they get the 500 billion they need. Now, they can determine how much the money is going to cost because traditionally, the longer the term, the higher the rate. In the past, a couple of years ago, if you wanted to borrow money for 10 years, the going rate was around 3.5%, whereas the rate on a 2-year was like 1.1%, 1.2%. So what the U.S. Treasury can decide how much of the 2-year, 5-year, 10-year notes they want to auction off. And if they want to do it all with 2-year notes, they can do it all with 2-year notes. Nobody says you have to do so many dollars worth of 10-year, so many dollars worth of 5-year. So that's how they've kept it down at 2.07%. And by the way, foreign countries, I think China owns about $2 trillion of U.S. debt. Insurance companies are big buyers of U.S. debt. Insurance companies are required by law to keep billions and billions of dollars in reserve, for hurricanes, tornadoes, natural disasters. And they don't want to keep that money sitting in a checking account or a savings account. So insurance companies will put that money in negotiable Treasury bonds, which they can cash in. If there's a hurricane and they need, $100 billion, they just cash in some of their Treasury bonds because typically they get a better rate of return on their Treasury bonds. Colleges and universities, I think we talked about, I know Princeton has like a $30 billion, what's the name of the fund? Not an annuity, but endowment. Harvard has, a $50 billion endowment. They put those monies in, a lot of that money in Treasury bonds. Some very rich people will put money in Treasury bonds. Anyway, so the Treasury has kept the interest rate down by 2% by, in the past, selling primarily 2- and 5-year Treasury notes, which carried an interest rate less than 2%. Now, what's happened in the past couple of months with inflation? The rate of return on a Treasury note, on a 2-year Treasury note, is an astounding 4.5%. Now, here's what happens. If your portfolio of borrowed money consists primarily of 2-year and 5-year notes, in addition, let's say you need $1 trillion of additional borrowed money this year, but you've got $4 trillion of old notes that you've previously sold that are maturing. They're going to roll over. So in addition to the trillion of new money you need to borrow, you have to sell another $4 trillion to replace the previously sold notes that are maturing and getting cashed in. So even though you only need $1 trillion of borrowed money this year, you have to auction off $5 trillion of new Treasury notes. Did you follow that?
Yeah, this is why I'm not in finance.
No, but you need me to go back up and go over that again?
No, I'm good. Yeah.
So again, you're constantly having to replace the maturing notes. Well, here's the issue. Those notes that used to carry a 1.25% interest rate, 2-year note is now carrying a 4.5% interest rate.
Mm-hmm.
So again, so the Treasury is going to be borrowing a lot more than just the 1 trillion. They're going to be borrowing about 5 trillion a year. It's $1 trillion of new money and 4 million of money to replace the old maturing notes. If that interest rate goes to 4% because of their having to sell off new notes to replace the old notes that have twice the interest rate, the interest alone is going to go from 620 billion to 1.2 trillion dollars. And that extra 600 billion will become part of the new federal budget. Can you imagine 1.2 trillion of a $6 trillion budget just going to pay the interest?
Yeah.
And that's where we're heading. By the way, this is what happened to Venezuela. It started a snowball effect, and the interest overwhelmed them. And unfortunately, that's where we're heading.
Mm-hmm.
It's just mind-boggling that we're on track to have 1.2 trillion in interest payments. Now, if somehow the inflation subsides and the interest rate on these short-term notes comes back down under 2%, that won't happen. But even 620 billion a year, which is what we're currently paying, is still an astounding number. Let me put it in this perspective: 620 billion a year in interest is about what we spend on the U.S. military every year. It's pretty close. I think we spend 750 billion on the U.S. military. So for almost the same amount of money we're spending on the military, we get nothing. We're just paying interest on money we've already borrowed. So, shaking my head. All right, let's move on to reparations. Now, in California, Governor Newsom is backing a proposal that would award $223,000 in reparations to every Black adult living in the state if they can prove they are a descendant of a slave. Now, a little background. Slavery was never legal in the state of California. From the moment they became a state, slavery was illegal in California. So any Black person living in California never had any ancestors in the state of California that was a slave. So if you're a Black person living in California and you have an ancestor who was a slave, your ancestor was a slave in a state other than California. The proposal that Governor Newsom is backing would award $223,000 in reparations to every adult Black living in the state if they can prove that they are descendants of a slave. So if your great-great-grandmother was a slave and you're living in California, you get a check for $250,000. If your wife was a Black woman and she's a descendant of a slave, you each get $250,000. You get $500,000. Now keep in mind, there's no means testing. So if you are if you are an NBA, a Black NBA or NFL player, or you're a successful doctor, Black doctor, lawyer, actor, singer, how many multimillionaire Black actors? Will Smith, how many Beyonce, how many multi-million-dollar singers and actors are living in California?
Thousands,
right? So since there's no means testings attached to this proposal, so say you're a Black NBA player, you have a network, you live in a $10 million home, you drive a Ferrari to work, but your great-great-grandmother was a slave, you would qualify for that $250,000 check, even though you're living in a multi-million-dollar home and driving a Ferrari. Now, let's keep going on how ludicrous this is. You ever heard of CalPERS?
No.
CalPERS is the California public employee retirement system. It is the largest employee pension plan in the United States. It's trillions of dollars. At the moment, CalPERS, which again is the largest pension plan in the United States, is only 72% funded, and the plan's unfunded liability is now estimated at, ready, $1.5 trillion. Now, the sum of those reparations payments is estimated at $560 billion. Now, that's discretionary. You don't have to do it. It's, okay, yeah, we could. We're under no obligation to pay this $560 billion. In the meantime, you have a legal obligation to fund your state employee retirement plan. You owe the plan, or you should have, you've underfunded the plan by 1.5 trillion. And rather than, let's assume you had the $560 billion to spend, don't you think if you were fiscally responsible, that you would put that 560 billion into your state's pension plan instead of
Yes,
creating a new program to give it away to people who may not need it?
correct.
So again, that's just today's, you have to look at what politicians, and from my perspective, I think it's just blatant vote buying. Like I can't think of any other reason why any sane politician would advocate a program like that when you're looking at you're looking at a potential crisis. And by the way, the state, their entire pension plan was funded on the assumption that they could continue year after year to get a 6% rate of return on the principal in that fund. Last year, I believe they lost about 600 billion because of the stock market, or this year actually. So they're not even coming close to the 6% estimated return on the fund. So if you're by the way, if you think it can't happen, about 10 years ago, the city of Detroit went bankrupt. And in the bankruptcy hearing, the bankruptcy judge told existing city employees and already retired employees, sorry, you're all taking a haircut. You ever heard the term haircut?
Not in those terms.
Well, when you talk about financial issues, a haircut is we're gonna discount either what you were promised or what you were getting. So if you were a retiree, used to work for the city of Detroit, when they went bankrupt, I'm just going to make up some numbers. If you were getting a $3,200 a month check from the city of Detroit, the bankruptcy judge said to those existing retirees, sorry guys, you're going to take a haircut, and we can't afford to pay you the $3,200 a month that you've been getting. Starting the first of next month, your $3,200 is going to be $2,300. And all you people who have been working for the city and you were promised this lavish pension plan, guess what? You're not, if and when you retire, you're not going to get it because the city's bankrupt. They overpromised. They don't have the money so they don't have the money. So it is not out of the question at some time in the future for all of these existing retirees and future retirees to be told by a bankruptcy judge, you're going to stop getting what you've been getting, and you're not going to get what you were promised. And that's where the state is heading. It's called kicking the can down the road. So it kind of makes me shake my head when I look at stuff like that. All right. Did you see the big news yesterday about Tesla's new electric tractor 18-wheeler tractor trailer?
No, I missed the tractor trailers.
Right. Well, Pepsi, by the way, which owns Frito-Lay, the potato chips and Doritos and whatnot, they committed to buy 17 fully electric 18-wheelers. And yesterday they accepted delivery of their first one, and they did a test run. And they did a 500-mile trip from the Tesla factory to one of their warehouses. They loaded the truck up with potato chips, and they drove back, and they still had 4% charge left, making the 500-mile round trip. Now, they didn't release exact numbers. Don't know if you know this, but by the way, the truck loaded with potato chips weighed 81,000 pounds. What do you think a truck? What do you think the potato chips weigh in the back of a truck?
Probably more than you'd think. I mean, I know they're pretty light, but when you have that many potato chips, it's probably pretty heavy.
Well, I think generally, I did some math, in terms of packages and cube. Generously, it'd be 4,000 pounds, which means that the truck and the batteries alone weigh 77,000 pounds.
Whoa.
Now, a traditional diesel engine tractor trailer empty weighs 35,000 pounds. So if you subtract from the only thing they wouldn't actually release the exact weight of the empty battery powered truck, but the batteries just, by the way, typical battery powered pickup truck or Hummer, weighs 50% more than a regular car just because the batteries are so massive. But if you back out 4,000 pounds of potato chips out of that 81,000, that meant the empty truck alone was 77,000 pounds. Now, there is a legal limit. Don't ask me how they got 1,000 pounds over, but there is a legal limit of 80,000 pounds for a tractor trailer. You know why there's a legal limit?
For road structure.
Two. Road is one. It's what the weight bearing capacity of bridges and roads, but the other is stopping distance. The heavier something is, the longer it takes to bring it to a stop. So if you jam on the brakes, if you're empty, you can stop in a shorter distance than if you're full. Well, there's a federal limit of 80,000 pounds for a tractor trailer. And this truck loaded with generously only 4,000 pounds of potato chips was already 1,000 pounds over, which means if you were to load it with something heavy like Pepsi or beer or tomato soup, well, first of all, you couldn't unless one of two things happened, unless you dramatically reduce the size of the battery pack. And if you dramatically reduce the size of the battery pack, you think you're going to get a 500-mile range out of that truck?
You're going to cut your range of your truck.
Going to cut your range in the truck. But let's assume that some politicians say, we're going to waive that 80,000 mile, we're going to waive that 80,000 pound restriction. You can have a truck that weighs 90,000 pounds. Well, guess what? With EVs, and this is a known fact, if you increase the weight of the truck, your range goes down. So let's say that they got politicians to waive that 80,000 mile restriction. And they now said, okay, you instead of 4,000 pounds potato chip, you can haul 14,000 pounds of tomato soup or Coors beer. Well, instead of getting 500 miles, you only get 250 miles. Let's say you're hauling steel or beer or tomato soup. Any guess at how long it would take to recharge a tractor trailer or the batteries in a tractor trailer?
Well, I know it takes like 12 hours to charge a car, so I'm imagining a tractor trailer is probably at least a day.
Right, and that's with the level 3 charge. And by the way, and as you get into some of these bigger battery packs, like in the Ford Lightning, and there's some Hummers out there that have battery-powered Hummers, they're looking at 18 hours for the Ford Lightning and some of the Hummers, and that's using what's known as a level 3, high capacity charger. So if it takes 18 hours to recharge a Ford Lightning pickup truck, it would be at least 24 hours to recharge your tractor trailer, which is easily going to have 4 times the size of a battery pack than a Ford Lightning pickup truck. So at 65 miles an hour, roughly how many hours does it take to go 250 miles?
4 or 5 hours.
Yeah, about 4 hours. So if you're driving one of these things and you got 10,000 pounds of tomato soup in the back, after 4 hours, you've gone 250 miles, you've depleted your batteries, and you got to pull over, and you're going to park for a day to recharge your battery. So if you're going to go cross country, stopping every 250 miles, let's say 3,000 miles divided by 250, so you're going to wind up stopping 15 times. It's going to take you 16 days to go cross country because you got to, every 250 miles, you have to stop and recharge for 24 hours.
Which a diesel truck you could probably do in what, 3-4 days?
You could do, you can drive 10 hours a day. You can do 600 miles a day. So you can do 600 miles a day. You can do 5 days coast to coast. So anyway, so that's why, yes, tractor trailers, EV trucks, box trucks, I think for in-town delivery, they're fantastic. But as a viable means of moving freight cross country, never going to happen. You cannot, the weight of the batteries alone and the recharge time does not make using EV tractor trailers cross country viable. All right. So I see we only got about 10 minutes left. By the way, talking about bankruptcies, you know where Chester, PA is?
Yeah, it's a suburb of Philadelphia.
By the way, I mentioned Detroit. I forgot to mention the city of Chester, PA is declaring bankruptcy. So the same thing that happened in Detroit is happening in Chester, PA, and all the retirees and city employees in Chester, PA, and by all the suppliers, the power company, anybody who provides, asphalt or, other materials to Chester, PA is going to take a reduced payment because Chester, PA is in bankruptcy.
Interesting, because I'm not super familiar, but it being a suburb of Philadelphia, I feel like it's a bit of a more affluent area too.
It is, and they also have a racetrack and a casino. So
Yeah.
here's a city Affluent suburb of the city of Philadelphia with a racetrack and a casino is declaring bankruptcy. And again, and who's going to suffer in addition to all the vendors and suppliers? The current city employees who are counting on their pensions and the existing retirees who are counting on that monthly pension check. They're all going to take a haircut. All right. So let's talk about the taxpayer relief shot. And for those of you who are only listening to the audio, it's about a music store and you can't see it. A man walks into this music store and he sees the wife of the owner behind the counter. And she's a frail woman. If you watch the video, she looks to be, maybe late 60s, frail. I don't think she weighs 110 pounds soaking wet. And he walks in kind of casing the place, decides, okay, this is going to be an easy one, goes back outside and comes back in and starts attacking the wife. The one thing with his nightstick trying to rob the store, the one thing he didn't count on was that the woman's husband was in the back. But before that, why do we call them taxpayer relief shots? Again, when the thug gets shot and killed, you're saving the taxpayers the cost of a jury trial, court-appointed attorney, the $80,000 a year it costs to keep a thug in jail. So 10 years in jail is $800,000. And let me, the sheriff of Santa Rosa County puts it, has a great way of expressing this. So it's not just me. Here we go. This is the sheriff of Santa Rosa County, Florida, rather. Here we go.
Somebody's breaking in your house, you're more than welcome to shoot them in Santa Rosa County. We prefer that you do, actually. Hopefully you'll save the taxpayers money.
And again, I just love that so much. Here we go. If you missed it the first time.
Somebody's breaking in your house, you're more than welcome to shoot them in Santa Rosa County. We prefer that you do, actually. Hopefully you'll save the taxpayers money.
And I don't know what it is about sheriffs in Florida, but here's another Florida sheriff. His name is Grady Judge. Here's how Sheriff Judge feels about bad guys.
I would highly suggest that if a looter breaks into your home, comes into your home while you're there to steal stuff, that you take your gun and you shoot him. You shoot him so that he looks like grated cheese.
And that was Sheriff Grady Judge. So I think we need more sheriffs in more states like those Florida sheriffs. But anyway, so let's go back to this news report of this poor old woman in Bethel Park, PA. Here we go. Let's see if I can get this to play.
Continuing to follow for you this morning, a music store owner fights back. He shot and killed a man who walked into the store and allegedly tried to attack the owner and his wife. This happened in Bethel Park. Channel 11 Shelby Zarotny talked with police and also with neighbors who know the owner.
Sylvia Armin's husband came to her rescue when an intruder attacked her with a wooden nightstick in their own music store. She returned to the music store for just a few minutes and had this to say to me. The same in the person was all Sylvia Armin would share with us. But according to Bethel Park Police, just after noon today, a man walked into Armin's House of Music on Route 88 and looked around, then left. Moments later, he returned, armed with a wooden nightstick, and started the attack.
Owner's wife was assaulted first.
The attacker, who we now know is 31-year-old Andrew Michael Moore of Washington County, went after Alfred Armin, but Mr. Armin fought back.
He did possess a firearm at the time. Violent struggle ensued, and the owner of the music store shot and killed the intruder.
News of the attack spread quickly. Chuck DeSalvo says the Armins have owned their music store for as long as he can remember, and says his friends did not recognize the man who attacked them.
Never saw him. She said he was a total stranger. Walked in and went and looked at the guitar.
More questions than answers as to why anyone would do this. Nearby pizza shop owner Bill Morgan was stunned when he heard about the attack on the elderly couple.
Yeah, it's been shocked. Like I have worked in some rough and tumble areas, and things like where this may or may not happen. But yeah, I never expected it here.
Bethel Park police are still investigating this case, still working on a motive or what brought Mr. Moore to this neighborhood music store here in Bethel Park. In the meantime, the medical examiner's office has not yet released the cause of death of Andrew Michael Moore.
Not released the cause of death. Gee, you get 3 guesses and the first 2 don't count. So by the way, yeah, and what do we call that when what's DRT stand for?
Dead right there.
Dead right there. That's what happened to the thug who was beating up on this old couple. I think they were both in their 60s or 70s. And again, without his gun, they would have been easy prey for this guy who was clearly younger, stronger than both of them put together. Anyway, I want to thank all of you who listened to this podcast for giving up 30 minutes out of your busy day to listen to me ramble on things about I find of interest and importance. I hope you found those topics as interesting and important as I did. And if so, I hope you continue to listen to the podcast in the weeks and the months to come. If you want to see some of the materials or story links you heard me talk about today, you can find them on the Jerzee Joe website at jerzeejoe.com. Just remember to spell Jerzee, Jerz, as in zebra, Zee, jerzeejoe.com. If you want to email me with a comment, question, or suggested show topic like one of our listeners did, just you can do that by just sending me an email to joe@jerzeejoe.com. Just remember to spell Jersey with a Z, Z-double-E. And with that, that's all I got. Sue, anything you want to add?
Nope. Happy December.
All right, good. And talk to you next week.
All right.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.